Thank you everybody for being here. We've got a lot of slides to go through, so I'm just going to dive right in. And we're going to start by looking at the TLS handshake. So the purpose of the TLS handshake, of course, is that the client and server want to agree upon a shared secret, and that's going to happen oftentimes through RSA-based key exchanges. So you have two modes of RSA key exchanges. You've got encryption-based and signature-based. Now, what we're focusing on for this talk is RSA encryption-based key exchanges. And that looks something like this. What we're really interested in here is only the one message, the client key exchange. And so what this contains is RSA encrypted pre-master secret data. So this is going to be the data that's used to later derive keys in this handshake and authenticate it. To understand what's going on here, we need to look at RSA encryption. The basic algorithms for RSA encryption are pretty easy to understand, but it can't really work this way in the real world. This is what we would call textbook RSA. And it breaks down when you're looking at values of 0 and 1. You've got identity arrangements here. And this is why we need padding. So padding is going to be a way that we're going to specially format our messages so that they will be appropriate for secure encryption through RSA. And the padding that's being used for TLS prior to 1.3 is PKCS number 1, 1.5. The structure of this looks something like this. We start out with a block type that's going to be a constant 0002. We then have some random bytes. The random bytes cannot contain any nulls because it is then terminated with null byte. And then we see the TLS version. Now you see here this has 0303. That naturally stands for TLS 1.2 because, yeah, it just does.
Yeah,
and
TLS versions are a thing. We could give a whole talk about TLS version numbers. Yeah, but that's not the topic of the talk today.
Yeah. The topic is more about this secret data here. These random bytes at the end, this is the pre-master secret in this case in the client key exchange. And Daniel Bleichenbacher had looked at this and considered the possibility of chosen ciphertext attacks on this. And so this is based on the fact that an RSA block is going to start with these static bytes, 0002, and we have to think about what happens when, what the server should do if it receives a value that decrypts but does not start with these values. So the initial idea here was just, why not send an error back, let the user know or let the client know that there was, for example, a wrong block type prefix. But this doesn't really turn out to be such a great idea because when you're doing this, that error message is actually leaking information about the encrypted data. So if you know that it has a correct prefix, you know that the value of the message is within certain ranges. And if it has a bad prefix, it's going to be outside of those ranges. Now, this combines with a factor of our property of RSA encryption known as malleability, in which we can multiply two plain text, or the multiplication of plain text has a correlation with the multiplication of the ciphertext there. So by multiplying a chosen ciphertext with the known ciphertext, you can derive that these plain texts have a relationship. And really at this point, it's important to reiterate that RSA is doing everything based on numbers. You're not talking about strings here. You're talking about messages and keys and modulo, and these are all just numbers. So what we can say then is that if we have some message times some chosen value, and that ends up starting with 0x or with 0002, that we know something. But what exactly do we know? What's the importance of this? Well, to get an idea of that, let's just look at a basic algebraic example here. Let's say that I give you a problem and you know that 3000 times the variable x is going to be a 5-digit decimal starting with the numbers 4 and 5. That means that 3000x, in other words, has to be greater than or equal to 45,000, but it has to be less than 46,000. We can reduce that, and you know that 15 is less than or equal to x and is less than 15.33. Now, if you get some additional information here and you learn that also 3010 times x follows that same property where you've got a 5-digit decimal starting with 45, then you get another interval. You can combine these intervals into a smaller range. And so with each time that you're learning about this other factor of x, you're able to narrow down the range. And the same principle, it works with RSA too. But it is just a bit more complicated because of the modula. You end up with multiple intervals that have to reconcile. But Bleichenbacher did derive a formula for going through this. And the long story of that is basically just that each time you get a positive response back from the server telling you that the padding was correct, you're narrowing in on the possibilities of the decrypted value. And after you've done this enough, you've got a small enough space that you can simply do a brute force search and recover the message. So there are various variations of this though. It's not necessarily always going to be that a server tells you that the block type prefix is incorrect. It could also be that the padding length or various other fields like the null byte might be in the wrong place. And so depending on what server checks are actually there, you're going to get different oracles, and these different oracles will have different strengths, meaning that they will require more or fewer numbers of connections to the oracle to get down to your final value.
Yeah. So, okay, so this was detected back in 1998. So after that, people, of course, wondered, what do we do now? How do we fix this? And so you have to remember, 1998, that was back, TLS didn't exist there. It was still called SSL. And then in 1999, the first TLS standard, TLS 1.0, was published, and this was the first standard that contained countermeasures against this kind of attack. And I'll just read this to you. The best way to avoid vulnerability to this attack is to treat incorrectly formatted messages in a manner indistinguishable from correctly formatted RSA blocks. Thus, when it receives an incorrectly formatted RSA block, a server should generate a random 48-byte value and proceed using it as the pre-master secret. Thus, the server will act identically whether the received RSA block is correctly encoded or not. So the idea here is, if a server detects something is wrong about this RSA message, it will not send an error, but it will continue with a random value and pretend everything is all right. And this will then fail later on, because obviously then the server and the client will end up with a different key, and there will be no useful communication. So if this sounds a bit strange to you, then maybe you're right, because maybe this was not the best fix, but that's what they came up with. Now, but the current TLS standard is TLS 1.2, and yeah, so that's basically what I said. So in case of a bad padding, a server should pretend everything is all right and then use a random value to continue the handshake. Now, the current TLS standard is TLS 1.2, and this section got a bit longer. So because someone figured out, okay, there are some problems with this old algorithm, particularly with the handling of the version number, someone figured out there's an attack very similar to Bleichenbacher's attack. And so TLS 1.2 says, yeah, as described by Klima, this was this improved Bleichenbacher attack. These vulnerabilities can be avoided by treating incorrectly formatted messages, blocks, and or mismatched version numbers in a manner indistinguishable from correctly formatted RSA blocks. And then it describes an algorithm with 3 steps here. Apparently in step 3, there's also a variation that it could do several different things. Then it goes on, it proposes another algorithm, which you could also use. The difference between the two is how you would actually handle a wrong version number. And then it tells you, although no practical attacks against this construction are known, Klima et al. Describes some theoretical attacks, and therefore the first construction is recommended. So we have 2 algorithms how to prevent this attack. We really should only use one of them, but yeah, the standard describes 2. And also, by the way, we should prevent timing attacks and other kinds of leaks. And yeah, so it's a really long section how to prevent these attacks. So to summarize that, so what you're supposed to do is that you generate a random value before you actually decrypt the message. And the reason for that is the timing attack. Because if you generate this random value after you figured out that this message is wrong, then the client could, depending on how long it takes you to generate this random value, kind of figure out whether you had a correctly formatted message or not. So you generate this random value anyway, and you only swap out your value if you figure out the padding is incorrect. Yeah. And if you have a bad version number, then the server can do different things. It could either continue with the random value, or it could replace the version with actually the correct version. There's a very subtle theoretical argument why this is preferable. So ultimately, the second variation is better, but we would like to make the standard longer and more complicated, and therefore we have two variations. And yeah, everything has to be timing safe, and please figure out how to do that. So it's totally easy, right? I mean, everyone will get this right. And I mean, it's ultimately, it's an attack from 1998, so everyone knows about this. It's a well-known attack. It's well documented. So everyone has regression tests for this, right? I mean, if you write a TLS library, you would have regression tests for known attacks. So this would not be a big deal, right? Or maybe it is. At some point last year, I thought I should actually test that, because like I knew about this attack, but I didn't really know if anyone had in recent years tried to exploit this attack or find vulnerable implementations. So in order to test this, initially I patched OpenSSL, so I was able to send different versions of broken RSA key exchanges, because what we want to know is whether, depending on different errors, the server behaves in different ways. And as soon as I get differences between these different error types, I know I have an oracle and this could somehow be exploited. And what you can look there at is not just error codes, but any kind of different behavior from the server you can detect can be used as an oracle. So these can be different TLS errors. This can also, we saw implementations that send duplicate TLS errors. I think this is not really considered by the specification, but some do this. We can also have servers that on some errors just close the connection, or that just don't answer anymore and you have a timeout. So there are different ways where you can have these oracles. And so I scanned the Alexa top 1 million list, and the first hit was Facebook. Facebook.com was vulnerable. So I thought, okay, we have to attack Facebook. And I thought it would be really nice to have a message that is signed with Facebook's key. Why would I do that? I mean, this doesn't really have any value. It doesn't put Facebook at risk in any way. But I would have cryptographic proof that this really happened. Like, nobody can tell me that I'm just making this up or anything. So I reached out to Juraj. He is like the third author of the paper who is not here. And together, like, we built together a proof of concept attack. And as we would need several thousands of connections to Facebook, we wanted this to be fast, so we didn't have to wait several weeks till it completed. So one thing we did, we tried to all AWS locations where you can rent servers from AWS and measured the ping times. And on some of them, we got ping times of 2 to 3 milliseconds to Facebook. We also figured out that if you have many very short connections, then using this option called TCP no delay gives you a huge speed up. So this was, I think, by a factor of 10 faster we got there with the attack. And yeah, after several tries, so we had several bugs in our script, which but after several tries we managed it, and we signed a message with Facebook's key. Of course, we reported that to Facebook. They also gave us a very generous bug bounty, and they fixed it, I think, about a week later. And then?
Yeah, so now at this point, after Facebook had delivered their patch, you can see if we send a crafted client key exchange that has improper padding, we just get generic alerts back. We're not seeing anything that is going to be an oracle anymore. But what happens if we play with the message flow a little bit? So going back to this diagram again, you should understand that each one of these blocks, they can be sent together, or a lot of them can be sent together in the same packet, or they can be split. And what we found is that when splitting these messages up, that Facebook would actually have some slightly different behavior. You could actually just omit the change cipher spec and the finished message, and you end up with something like this. So now this is with after Facebook had deployed their first patch. We run our test again, but this time we are not sending out the final change cipher spec and finished message. And you can see on the left here, when we send an invalid padding, Facebook is immediately tearing down the connection with the TCP FIN. But if we have a PCI conforming client key exchange, meaning it has that valid block prefix and everything, Facebook servers were leaving the connection open, waiting for us to send more data. And it turned out that Facebook was not the only server that was doing this. When we kept scanning the internet, we found that various other products. So for example, F5's Big IP here, this is one of the various oracles that was in their product. You can see that they were sending an alert in one case and leaving the connection open in the other case, but only if we would not send that change cipher spec and finished message. And just as one more example, with the Citrix NetScaler, this one we would send the full exchange and the connection status would again indicate to us whether or not we had valid padding.
So yeah, so what is the impact of this? You would assume, okay, we can decrypt messages. That sounds pretty bad, but in practice it's a bit more complicated. So we learned earlier that there are these two different ways to do TLS handshakes. One is this older RSA encryption modes, and there are these more modern modes that use only RSA signatures and use a Diffie-Hellman key exchange. And if a server or a client only support this old mode, so we have a connection with this old mode, this is kind of the most devastating attack, because then we can just record that data, later on do the attack, and then decrypt all the data. However, these days, most people prefer to use these more modern modes, of course, and they still support RSA encryption for legacy connections, but they would usually not use them because all the modern browsers support these Diffie-Hellman modes, and if you have a server that supports both, then it would choose the Diffie-Hellman mode. This could still be attacked in theory, but in order to do that, you would have to do this attack really fast. And as I mentioned earlier, we're talking about several tens of thousands of connections. So this would be challenging. And we think this might be possible, but we've never performed such an attack. So we don't know if it's practical. But if you think about a target like Facebook, they have many servers, they are fast, so you could also parallelize this attack. So you could run it from 10 different places on the internet. And so this should be feasible, but we never tried it in practice. But still, the idea is, like, even if server and client support these more modern modes and have this fallback to this older mode, that could still be used for an attack, but this is a much more challenging attack. Yeah, Facebook, of course, was not the only vulnerable host. So here are a few others. Maybe you recognize some of the company names. I heard some of them are quite well known, like Apple.com, Cisco.com, eBay, PayPal, something from Microsoft. The thing here is, so we knew all these web pages are vulnerable, but what's really a challenge if you do something like this is then we need to find the vendors. And so we're trying to contact the owners of these web pages, but many people are not very happy to tell you about what products they're using. For example, like the first one here, the Apple.com. Apple is using Citrix devices, but they didn't want to tell us this. Trying to contact a lot of web pages, after all, we found a lot of vendors that were vulnerable, so we figured out, yeah, F5 devices were vulnerable, Citrix devices, Radware, Cisco had two different products that were vulnerable. Then we tested various open source libraries. We found that Bouncy Castle was vulnerable, Erlang, Wolf SSL. And then after we published our paper, other people found out that there were more vulnerable products. For example, Palo Alto Networks, IBM, several products from Symantec, Unisys, what was it? ClearPath MCP?
Yeah, ClearPath MCP.
I heard it's important. I have no idea what it is. And Cavium chips, which are accelerator chips, which are used in many other products. So we had a long list of vulnerable vendors. The Cisco thing was particularly interesting. So we heard from some web page operator that they were using a Cisco ACE. And so we contacted Cisco about it, obviously. And Cisco told us, yeah, we won't fix this because this device has been out of support for many years. So we're not doing any updates on this anymore. And this vulnerability was particularly severe because these devices didn't support any of these Diffie-Hellman modes. So you would always have this classic RSA key exchange, so we could easily decrypt traffic from that. But there were a lot of web pages that were still using these ACE devices. For example, Cisco.com. And like, I told them that, and they didn't answer that email. And a few weeks later, I said, yeah, we're going to publish this soon. And I think Cisco.com is running these ACE devices. And I'm going to publish that too. Do you want to comment on that? Didn't get an answer on that. It's no longer running on that right now. But
well,
yeah.
Or they have a firewall in front of it.
Yeah, maybe they have a firewall. Maybe you can figure out what the origin is still. Yeah. What we also did is that we tried to reach out to developers of test tools. And I mean, probably most of you know this, right? This is the test from Qualys, the SSL Labs test, which is very popular when you want to know if your TLS configuration on your website is any good. And I think this is a crucial thing here because, I mean, we're talking about vulnerability from 1998. And why is this still around? And the obvious answer is nobody was testing for it before we did this research. Like all the commonly easily available tools, they didn't have a test for this vulnerability. And that's, I think, why it was still around and why it was still so prevalent. So we reached out to SSL Labs and they added a check for it. And yeah, as you can see here, now you get an F if you're vulnerable to this attack. We reached out to Test SSL, which is a very powerful SSL testing tool, which is written in Bash. So quite impressive. TLS Attacker, which is written by one of our co-authors, so, and TLS Fuzzer, which is from a Red Hat developer. And also Tripwire's.
Yeah, Tripwire IP360 will scan for it as well.
Yeah. So before Robot, no test tool was available really for Bleichenbacher attacks. And after that, so we hope that now these vulnerabilities will be detected more easily. And we also think we were successful with that because, as I said earlier, after we published this research, many more products showed up to be vulnerable, which we did not know about before. Yeah, what we also did was a capture the flag contest. So we thought, yeah, we want to give people a chance to try to re-implement this attack. So originally we did not publish our attack tool. We have published it later after the capture the flag. So, and we set up a vulnerable host and we gave people an encrypted message and they should decrypt it by implementing this attack against this host. And then they got a message which told them about the second host, but it only gave them the key of that host. And interestingly, this seemed to be the most difficult part because I got many people asking me, hey, how do I find your second host? You're only giving me the key. The idea there was that you can use that key and search in the certificate transparency database and then find the host name, and then you had that host. And the second step was then you had to sign a message. Because the attack for signatures it requires an additional step, so this is a bit more complicated. And I think we had like 10 people who finished the capture the flag successfully. So I think this was a nice thing. So when you publish a vulnerability, also give people a chance to practically play with it. Then there's this issue of timing attacks. So we did not really look into this in detail, but I mentioned it earlier that particularly these changes in TLS 1.2 were also to prevent timing attacks. So these timing countermeasures are relatively complicated, and there are some TLS stacks where it's well known that they just don't implement protection against these timing attacks. For example, in NSS, there's an open bug, but it's been open since several years. I guess it's not that relevant because almost nobody is using NSS on servers. But yeah. But then we learned something, that even if you implement the specification from TLS 1.2, which should protect you against timing attacks, you may still have a problem. And that comes back to this, that crypto is just math. So when we talk about cryptographic keys or signatures, everything, it's just, we're talking about numbers, right? Cryptographic key, an RSA key is 2 numbers, a signature is 1 number. And so these cryptographic libraries like OpenSSL, they use big num libraries. That is, like, they have mathematical functions that operate on numbers of arbitrary size. And this has the effect that if you have smaller numbers, they take less memory. Because, like, you have, I don't know, your number is 500 bytes large, so you have a buffer of 500 bytes, maybe a size value in front, and there you store your number. But if you have a smaller number, it's less space. And if you look back at RSA, okay, RSA is just some formula where you do some exponentiation and a modulus. And if you have a standard key size, then the result is 256 bytes large, usually. But it may start with a 0, and then it's 255 bytes, or 254 if it starts with 2 zeros. So simply the fact that this big num library has a variable size may give you another timing signal, because storing 255 bytes takes less time than storing 256 bytes. So you may have a side channel due to the use of big num libraries with variable size. If this is practical, we don't know. This is kind of an open research question. If someone wants to have a research topic, would be an interesting one. And to our knowledge, this affects practically all common TLS libraries. David Benjamin from Google has recently fixed this in Boring SSL and has submitted a pull request to OpenSSL. But right now, they are still, the stuff that's out there is usually vulnerable to this.
Yeah, so one of the other things that we were seeing during scans of the internet is a lot of hosts would respond, let's say, inconsistently. So in some cases, I would see that, or we would see that certificate chains would actually come back to you in response to a malformed client key exchange. But in other cases, we would actually just see what appeared to be random bytes, high entropy streams of data, unclear what it was exactly. The only vendor that we were able to pin down on this is this Communicate Pro, but there are definitely others out there based on looking at the data that we had from scans of the Alexa top million sites. And this leads me to believe that maybe there's something out there that's like a Heartbleed style bug within the way that these things are being processed. And so perhaps if some of you want to take the robot detect script and run it against obscure hosts that you have, if you get inconsistent results, might be worth digging into that a little bit further to see what's going on.
Yeah. So after that, you may wonder, what should we do about this? Because, like, these countermeasures are really complicated and many people get them wrong. And then there are still these timing issues, even if you do the countermeasures. And what we actually recommend is that if you run TLS, then just disable these RSA cipher suites. So we did some checks where we logged connections to web pages. These were not the most high volume web pages, but a reasonable sample, I think. And we saw practically no legitimate connections that were using these old cipher suites. So almost everyone these days is using a browser that will support one of the more modern modes. And this also gives you forward secrecy, which is a nice property cryptographically. So we would recommend, if you run a server that's using TLS, just consider disabling these old cipher modes. Because really, I don't believe there's any implementation out there right now that I would call robust on this. TLS 1.3 will no longer support these modes anyway, because it has deprecated a lot of bad stuff. We're expecting that TLS 1.3 will now be published every day. Took a bit longer, but yeah. You may still be at risk even if you're using TLS 1.3, because we mentioned earlier that you could do these signature attacks where you're doing a man-in-the-middle attack by attacking the property that the server still supports these old RSA encryption modes. So even if you have TLS 1.3, the attack may still be possible in some circumstances. So ideally, just disable these modes if you can. And then we definitely recommend no longer use RSA with PKCS 1.1.5. This is a standard from the 90s. It has many problems. It also if you use it for signatures, there are other problems with it. And there's a more modern version of this PKCS standard, which is using something called OAEP for encryption and PSS for signatures. I think the first version has been published in 2001. And it's not really clear why TLS doesn't use that until now. It will use it in TLS 1.3, but yeah. So really, don't use these legacy modes. They have so many problems. If you want to use RSA, I mean, you could of course also use more modern crypto algorithms. But if you want to use RSA in anything new you build, please use these more modern encryption modes. Yeah. So our takeaways here is old attacks still work. You can win a Pony Award by recycling a 20-year-old attack. We recommend stop using the TLS RSA modes in TLS and stop using PKCS 1.1.5. Yeah.
And also, if you do have a server that does support the TLS RSA ciphers, but also supports forward secrecy, if somebody is able to do this attack fast enough, they would be able to do a downgrade to force the client to use TLS RSA ciphers.
Yeah. So, yeah, I think we have plenty of time for questions.